Seattle Democrats say, we want a ceasefire, yes, and here is an additional $14 billion for bombs and gunfire so you can kill thousands more babies, it is simply not real.
Well, there you have a fiery council member, Kshama Sawant, challenging her colleagues a few days ago with a resolution condemning the violence in Gaza. With the departure of Councilmember Sawant and a few more members of the council's progressive bloc, are resolutions like this a thing of the past? Interesting question there. Plus, a sobering report on voter turnout statewide, a deadline ahead on building affordable housing at Fort Lawson, an update on fare ambassadors on Link Light Rail, and a whole lot more. We are considering these topics on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week. We're your coffee break political podcast, and I'm Brian Callanan, a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine. I'm with co-host David Croman of the Seattle Times. David, I just wanted to make sure I went over the Thanksgiving holiday with you because we're visiting after that. I had some family in town and staying with us for 5 days. I'm talking about mom and dad and brother and his family. House was kind of bursting at the seams here. Was your house any calmer than mine? I just wanted to ask.
We didn't have that many people because we have a 1-year-old, but that doesn't mean it's calmer because we have a 1-year-old. So,
yeah,
but I think yes, it was a nice holiday.
Fair enough. I think you still win on this one. And here's to having a good 1-year-old that's growing up right. Here we go. Thank you, David. Thank you, as always, to our background noise sponsor, too, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our show patrons. A shout out to Callie this week. She's been supporting this show on Patreon since July of last year. Way to go, Callie. And Patreon is where you can help keep this show going, folks. If you can be a patron at the $5 level, guess what? I can send you your very own highly sought after Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. Please look for Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Learn more about what's going on and become a patron on the show. Thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get rolling. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, folks, a report in the Seattle Times this week confirming what the trends of this odd year election have been pointing towards for the past several weeks here. November 2023 had the lowest voter turnout on record in state history. Let that sink in, folks. About 36% of us voted, leaving nearly 2 out of 3 people who did not vote at all. Very important points to ponder here with a Seattle election where we had some council races decided by just a few hundred votes. David, I just wanted to make sure I brought you in and asked you about this. What do you make about these low numbers? It's difficult to say exactly why here, but it certainly isn't a good thing for the state of our democracy.
No, I mean, of course, odd year elections that don't have national implications are always much lower turnout.
Yeah,
by an order of half.
Yeah.
And then there wasn't. I would say that there probably wasn't like a single animating issue on this in this year as there have been in the past. Amazon's involvement in 2019 kind of invigorated turnout and. To a certain extent, a mayoral election, it's citywide. So there's sort of a broader conversation, at the city level with district elections, the races are so localized that it's sort of, the environment kind of loses that broad narrative that unites the whole city. It turns it into more kind of atomized, kind of hyper local conversations, which then I think, make it maybe a little bit more difficult for voters to find out information about their race. And, they maybe just don't see it as quite as important. Why this year was particularly bad, I'm not really sure. Just tiredness, maybe general malaise, perhaps.
Yeah, I know some people have posited that perhaps it was the fact that we're seeing fewer and fewer of these statewide initiatives on the ballot. There are referendums, and that used to be a situation where we'd see 2 or 3 of them every year, and now it's a situation where we're not even seeing any at all. It's expensive to put on those types of races there and work on those referendums, and I think maybe that depressed the statewide numbers too. What do you think about that theory?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Again, it kind of goes to the question of whether or not there's like a unifying issue or something that people can all sort of collectively debate. And there just wasn't really that. And an initiative is something that might be able to do that. Gun control or something kind of intensely, that people feel intensely about, might drive more turnout. There was a lot of spending in this election, of course, but there wasn't as much as there has been in the past. So, maybe that's part of it. Again, I just think it's the sort of lack of a clear unifying narrative that everybody, like everyone in the city or the state, is saying yes or no to.
Yeah, and it's really difficult to draw a direct correlation between any of these things we're talking about in the turnout. I think it's a host of different factors here. But it comes to this next question here, David. So, as it stands now, the state requires cities and local districts to hold their general elections in odd years, but there are some state lawmakers out there. The city's been talking about this too, looking to change that, allow for even year elections to get more people to fill out the ballot. Where do you stand on that issue? Is that a good idea to move these races to an even year?
Yeah, I mean, if your goal is turnout, then it's pretty hard to dismiss that lining it up with national elections would increase turnout.
Yeah.
We tend to hear more conversation about this when from a side who didn't do particularly well in their races. So right now, I mean, I would say in general, it's been kind of more of a progressive issue because progressives in Seattle and King County feel that if they can turn more people out, they're going to do better. We look at this last city council election, a lot of the progressive candidates lost by the margins that are missing from past elections. So, the drop in turnout fairly closely aligns with the drop in support for progressive candidates. So
and a drop in a lot of younger voters too.
Yeah, exactly. Which of course then tend to vote more progressive. So, I think we're hearing more from that side that it would make sense. There are certainly disadvantages too, just as far as, I mean, there's one argument that if you make the ballot itself too long, that might drive down participation. I'm not sure I buy that. It's only going to be a couple pages, but I do think that if we're concerned about whether or not people are making informed decisions or getting information that they need, I think when you would have that many, try and imagine having 7 city council members up for election in the same year as a presidential and congressional race. There's just like a lot of news stories that might not get written because of capacity and people's capacity to read. So that, I can see both sides to this argument.
Yeah, that whole idea of having a crowded ballot and having that issue that it's the very end of it, but it's a very important issue locally. I think that's been talked about by a lot of the different elected leaders for a long time here. Can't make it any easier to vote, folks, in terms of voting and sending it in by mail. But this is a discussion I know that's going to be happening at the state level once the legislature reconvenes in just a matter of a few weeks here. So we'll see what happens there. All right. Well, no full council meeting this week for the Seattle City Council, but one issue that caught my eye was a committee meeting, the Select Committee on Climate Action. They don't have a lot of meetings, but they do have one this week headed up by Councilmember Herbold. The ordinance they're discussing, a requirement to transition large non-residential and multifamily buildings to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. So this applies to buildings 20,000 square feet or bigger, excluding parking, and building owners would have to submit a plan showing how this is happening no later than 2030, so not that far away, about 6 years. There are roughly 3,600 buildings of this size in Seattle. If they're not complying by the year 2031, building owners can submit a payment in lieu of compliance at that point, but by 2035, that switches to a harsher financial penalty. I wanted to lay all that out, David, because I think there are some very big goals here in terms of this net zero greenhouse gas emission piece and a lot of enforcement to consider too. What are your thoughts about the rollout of a big program like this in the city?
My thoughts are, how's it going to be followed through on, and how is it going to, the ideas are common in City Hall, but the question is implementation. How is it paid for? How's it enforced? How's it followed up on? That's when I think I will start paying closer attention is when there's a clear plan to actually make these things happen and have people looking over the shoulders of those who should be making it happen.
Yeah. And the cost of it is a big piece too. I just wanted to bring in this factor as well. The city of Seattle itself has 54 buildings over 20,000 square feet that still use fossil fuels. In the language of this ordinance, they actually point out that Magnuson Building 30 up there on the northeast part of Seattle in Magnuson Park, that would have to go through a serious upgrade costing $5 million. So that's just the cost of updating it. I know there's a lot of different people that own these different buildings around Seattle. That's going to carry a big cost. And then this impact on staffing at the city level is real too. And I was just considering, David, the way this is going to impact Seattle City Light. They're going to have people out there putting in new meters, putting in new electric service and things of this nature. I guess, are we ready for that part of it? I just feel like this is a big impact on the grid of Seattle, and I'm not quite sure how City Light is going to respond to that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think City Light, like a lot of kind of trade departments, don't have the staff that they used to. Right. I just, anytime there's a big initiative like this, you just bring up that the city council is facing a $240 million hole next year that they're going to have to fill. And so, adding new expenses and new staff and new resources just seems like it's probably not in the cards. I mean, I think as far as the electricity goes, we have plenty of it because of hydro. It is kind of interesting anytime City Light upgrades, in some ways City Light's goals are also making it financially and existentially endangered. Anytime a building is upgraded and become more efficient, they lose money. And
right.
Kind of too good at it these days. So I think there are some broader challenges for City Light that doesn't really affect this decision, which I think is really going to be made more on, do they have the money and the people to do it?
Yeah. No, this is an interesting one, and it's this conversation that's just starting right now, but I know it's something that's very important to Councilmember Herbold, that she wants to get some movement on it before the end of the year. So that's the kind of flurry of activity you're going to see here in December as they try to jam in as much as they can in the next couple of weeks before they actually leave office. So something to keep an eye on there as well. All right, well, up next, a deadline looming for the city of Seattle on an affordable housing project that has taken years to develop. What's the holdup, and what is next for Fort Lawton? The story next on Now Hear This. Well, an important deadline ahead for the city of Seattle when it comes to building housing on Fort Lawton, that surplus military land in Discovery Park up in the Magnolia neighborhood. The Seattle Times reports the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, has raised some concerns about how the city has really dragged its feet on this project after approving it 4 years ago. And HUD's now saying, all right, Seattle, you have until late December to get this figured out. This housing project has been in discussion literally for years. It was actually March of 2019 when I was talking about this with Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda on the Seattle channel.
This is an effort to try to make sure that we're addressing the housing crisis in Seattle and doing it in a thoughtful way. We're talking about housing seniors. We're talking about housing vets. We're talking about creating affordable housing for new families who need 3 bedrooms.
David, I know the COVID pandemic did not help in getting this project rolling, but we're at the point now where Mayor Harrell, I should say, has apparently asked for a reassessment of this project. As you might imagine, the cost to build this, especially to add infrastructure, continues to rise. Mayor Harrell says it pencils out to nearly $700,000 per unit. They were talking about building about 240 of them here. So do you scrap the whole idea of building housing here? There was so much consensus to make this happen in 2019, and now it looks like it might be evaporating. Some thoughts on this, David?
Yeah, it's a pretty frustrating situation because there had been consensus on this, but this is what happens when you let process drag out. And we're seeing this kind of all over Seattle and Washington. It's the real danger of letting the Seattle process kind of slow things down like this because, at the time, interest rates were basically nothing. And, it just felt like the city had all the time in the world to make this happen. And there just didn't feel like there was the urgency to actually act on it. Now suddenly interest rates are what they are, supply chain, the costs have gone up and, apparently the site needs some work. So, I mean, the question that the city needs to should there be affordable housing on the site? And it seems like the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, then it's not going to get any cheaper the longer they wait, which is where we're at right now. And, I think for some people who live in the area, kind of, this is good news because there have been people who have been trying to slow and stop this project for many, many years. And so this seems like kind of a chance that they're seizing one more time to finally kill this project. But, is at this point, is building affordable housing in other places going to be cheaper? I don't know.
Right.
I suppose they could buy more buildings, but it's just, this to me falls into the category of the missing link or the civic square across from City Hall, just a project that has just been the projects that have just stretched on for so long.
Yeah.
And I think are just objectively frustrating to anybody who has paid any attention.
Oh, yeah. And I guess I'm just looking at this idea of, okay, so they're saying, 240 units or something along those lines. It sounds like there's a lot of costs involved with putting in infrastructure and things of this nature here. And I know there's been some push to say, all right, well, if it doesn't make sense with 240 units, why can't we build it a little more? Meaning put in more units and maybe make this pencil out a little bit better. Do you think that's a path forward? Or I don't know. I know the dollars and cents are the final arbiter on this thing here. How do you make this pencil out, I guess, is my big question.
Yeah, I mean, that's an option is put more units there because,
Yeah.
You're paying for the utility upgrades one way or the other. So
Right.
Put more units there. I think that the people who have been opposing this project from the start will have something to say about that. I don't know what that means for environmental analysis and all those kinds of process-driven things. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's starting to look like it might fall into that category of the civic square of just something that dies by attrition, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you heard anything new on that one with the Civic Square? That one, we've been waiting so long, and I guess the pandemic slowed that down as well. Any plans about that? Anything new that you hear about that around downtown?
No, not since. I mean, yeah, there was movement on it, and they actually had some construction
Right.
equipment in there, and then the pandemic made it go kaput. I'd have to walk down the hall and ask my colleague Heidi Gruber, who covers that. But no, I haven't heard anything new.
Yeah, nor have I. I head into City Hall myself all the time, and it's just, wait a minute, what's that big hole doing over there? So anyway, something to consider there in the future too. All right, I wanted to move on to another issue that I found very interesting here, and this was the idea at the top of the show. I brought this up. Councilmember Sawant's resolution calling for a ceasefire in the conflict between Israel and Hamas. That resolution also condemning anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate. This came out of a 5-hour meeting last week that had a lot of budget stuff going on with it too. But there were plenty of protesters in council chambers specifically for this issue, I should say, with regard to this vote in particular. 3 council members abstained: Lewis, Nelson, Peterson. The other 6 council members voted yes. And I just wanted to ask this, David, with all these council members leaving, Councilmember Sawant probably most particularly, is the age of aspirational council resolutions dead? I mean, we have seen these before with the council members weighing in on foreign conflicts or favoring a ban on circus animals, infamously back in the early 2000s. Will we see these types of resolutions again with the new council that's coming on board in 2024?
Yeah, I don't think so. This was always sort of an attack line for the people who didn't like council member Sawant.
Yeah, right.
Pointing to these types of resolutions and saying, here's what she's doing instead of fixing your potholes or whatever it might be. Even though, I think they were always basically didn't take a lot of time. And I imagine that most people in City Hall were able to walk and chew gum at the same time. But it was, it wasn't, if you were frustrated with the state of the roads or whatever, it would be frustrating. It's frustrating to see the council focusing on sort of international issues and things like that. And so I think there will continue to be resolutions. I mean, some resolutions have a bit more power than these in that they lay out plans. There was a resolution tied to the jumpstart tax saying, it's non-binding, but it says basically, here's how we intend to spend this money. That kind of resolution, I think, will continue. But the sort of resolution of an official city platform on a national issue, I don't know. That said, if Donald Trump is reelected president, there were a ton of those kinds of resolutions when he was in office, and I could see them returning to that and doing more kind of specifically Trump-focused resolutions.
Yeah, I remember that too, when they were making resolutions regarding the city being a welcoming city in terms of inviting people who are immigrants and things of that nature. And I guess that's that next question. Are resolutions like this that maybe have that more global perspective, are they important in terms of intention signaling or whatever you want to call it? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know. The important, I think they give the city an identity to a certain extent, and there's something to that. As far as what they actually do, probably not very much. But I mean, that's sort of a larger question of like whether you think protests
Sure.
matter, or whether you think boycotts matter. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it is part of that larger question of things that don't maybe have an immediate effect on the issue, but perhaps contribute to some larger shift in the conversation that trickles upwards to people who do have authority.
Yeah, and I mentioned Councilmember Sawant because she has brought up a lot of these resolutions that have a more global perspective, as I mentioned it there, talking about caste discrimination and having the city speak out about that. And I just wonder, as she departs, where do her protest folks go that are holding up the red signs, et cetera? Are they going to continue to come back to City Hall? Are they going away? That part of it is very interesting to me. As she steps aside and works on a more national frame here, are her protesters the protesters that clearly are part of what she does, are they still going to be a part of City Hall? What do you think?
I think yes, to an extent. I think the socialist alternative will probably be in City Hall. I would imagine that Kshama Sawant will be in City Hall.
Yeah.
Protesting to an extent, but not to the level. I mean, I don't think that constituency will shift to I don't know, Tammy Morales necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't seen that. I mean, even when Nikita Oliver was running for mayor, there was a sort of surprising lack of overlap there. We just didn't see. I think that socialist alternative constituency has always been pretty attached to Kshama Sawant and nobody else. So I don't think there will be a new council member who is, cheering that on. I do think they might show up sometimes with Councilmember Sawant, but that'll actually be an interesting follow-up story to see what actually her national ambitions end up leading to and where she goes from here.
Agreed. Yeah, and I'm very interested to see what that's like, because it's been a pretty raucous council meeting every now and again, as you know, over the past 12 years, real close to that, with Councilmember Sawant in office. So we will see what happens with these resolutions and with the makeup of the council, certainly in the months ahead here. Thank you very much for that, David. All right, we're moving on to another piece here, going in depth with Sound Transit's new plan for fare ambassadors. David's taking us on a trip, coming up on Transportation Talk. David, you took a trip with a few of these new fare ambassadors Sound Transit now has in place on light rail. They're out there making sure people are paying their fares, which has definitely been a problem post-pandemic. What did you observe? Is this program working? How would you describe it?
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in doing that because, I mean, I was just kind of curious, like, who would want this job?
Right.
I mean, because it's interesting, right? It used to be just security officers who would ask you for your fare, and that's a fairly easy to understand job. But this one is, people are being kind of tasked with being two different and oftentimes opposing things, which is on the one hand, an authority figure enforcing the policy of Sound Transit. You have to pay to be on the train, and these people are here to make sure you do it. But also they're sort of supposed to be, in some ways, an outreach worker, or not quite a social worker, but some kind of point of contact to people who need maybe larger help, homelessness or drug addiction or mental health or whatever it might be. And so the question for me is can those two things be balanced in a real way? And was the kind of person who can balance them? I don't think I answered that definitively, but sort of provide an insight into the folks who see it as, in some ways, I think the people who do that job see it as a point of help first, and sort of enforcement second, which is interesting. And I think that's the kind of people who want to do that job. One person that I talked to or followed used to be homeless himself. Another person worked in customer service. But it does sort of raise the question of, suddenly the Sound Transit Board is increasing their pressure to resume fare collections and to bring back fare revenue. Right. And so can people like that who are in it to help people also be efficient at making sure people are paying their fares? And I think that's a real problem right now, because it takes a lot of, if you want to be helpful to people, that takes a lot of time. And that's time that's not spent checking fares.
Right.
So it's an interesting, tension there, and one that the fare ambassadors themselves sort of acknowledge, and they haven't haven't really figured out yet. I do think it's it's a tension that I don't know that has been tested fully yet, and will be interesting to see if it's one that frankly can survive. If it can actually do both the things it's supposed to do equally well.
Right. And it just sounds like Sound Transit has to do something, because when we voted on the expansion of Sound Transit 3, or just Sound Transit in general, I think it was something along the lines of saying, all right, we're going to make sure that we get 40% of our revenue from from fare recovery there. Those numbers are certainly a lot lower than that. I think 16% is one of the most recent ones that I saw. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty stark difference there. And I just look at this, and fare ambassadors, I get it, and I understand why the program's in place, but is there a reason we don't have turnstiles out there? I went to school in the Bay Area. I remember going on BART. You put in your ticket, it opens, you go through, it closes. And I just wonder why is that not part of the conversation, I guess?
Yeah, we get this question anytime we write about fare enforcement, and I do think it's probably time for us to just answer that, look at that question once and for all. I think the main thing is cost, as it would cost. Yeah. I think they estimated like $1 billion to install
okay.
Turnstiles. That said, I mean, the fare collection, the estimates for how much fare collection they'll have through 2046 have just been revised downward by about $1 billion. So
right.
I think, I saw the Urbanists had gotten their hands on a memo, and it sounds like Sound Transit staff are at least raising the idea. I think, you've seen how the pace of basically anything at Sound Transit, if it is an idea to be considered, it will be considered for many, many years. But yeah, I think it's probably time for us, because we get this question a lot, to take a close look at why not put turnstiles in? What are the barriers to that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I know also there are a number of different agencies around the state, transit agencies, smaller ones, though, that are actually providing transit for free, which a lot of people would like to see, just to make sure that people are using it. So, I'm always interested in that dynamic there about how fares are recovered. And I look forward to it, David. I know you're going to be doing more stories on Sound Transit, so we will see what happens with these fare ambassadors moving forward here. All right. Well, it is time to wrap up here, David, and I want to keep that hot stove cooking with you on the wintertime baseball moves here. So Mariners traded Eugenio Suarez. Going to miss hearing that name. So maybe there's some more room on the payroll here. Who are they chasing after this off season? I know we've talked about Shohei Ohtani a lot, but what do we got, man? Who's out there? What's going to happen for the M's?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I hope something. It doesn't look great right now, but there's a pipe dream about Yoshinobu Yamamoto, the sort of phenom pitcher from Japan. That would be neat. Some talk about Blake Snell, who's a local guy, and he
raised the flag for the 12s not too long ago at Seahawks Stadium, right?
Yeah, I have some concerns about how much money he will want and whether that's worth it. But yeah, I don't know. My hunch is they will do something dramatic, and it will not be what any of us expect.
Totally. Yeah. That's the way it usually happens with the Mariners. Are you going to miss Eugenio Suarez? I always thought he brought a smile to fans' faces, and he was a bit of a fan favorite there.
I am. Yeah, I liked him a lot. I am sad to see his personality go. I think they could have gotten back more from that trade. And at the same time, I think it was probably the right time to move on from him, because he still has some perceived value, but it seems to be dropping quickly. Aging high strikeout home run hitters tend to not last too long into their 30s. So I guess I'm not super mad to see him go. I do think maybe the return was a little weak. Yeah. And I hope, and they need to replace him, but we'll see.
That's true. That's true at third base there. So we'll see what happens on that one. Oh man, so much more to discuss with that, but let's hope the good vibes stick around even after Suarez takes off here. Well, thank you, David, as always, for joining me here. Thanks to everyone who's listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews throughout the week here. You can always find us and find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you might like to listen. Please do find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and show your support. That's how the show keeps on rolling here, folks. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media as well. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.